Welcome in. You know how sometimes history feels inevitable, like a straight line? Of course things happen that way. Well, today we're going to mess with that a little. We're doing a deep dive on the civil rights movement, a period I know you're fascinated by, and for good reason, but we're adding a twist.
We're going to play What If, digging into those pivotal moments and asking, what if things had gone a little differently? What if those dominoes had fallen another way?
Exactly. It's not just about what did happen, but why it mattered, and those seemingly small choices, the ones that might have changed everything. You've provided some incredible material on this, and one thing that jumps out is the butterfly effect.
It's so fitting when we talk about the civil rights movement, this idea that even small actions, things that might seem insignificant at the time, can ripple outward and create these massive changes.
Okay, so let's talk Rosa Parks. Iconic, right? Refusing to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus, 1955. It's almost like the symbol of resistance. But what if she hadn't?
See, this is what's fascinating. While Parks's act was a catalyst, no doubt, it's crucial to understand the context. The groundwork for the Montgomery Bus Boycott, for the entire movement really, was laid long before that day.
You're talking about those earlier figures the material mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey. They were fighting for similar rights decades earlier.
Exactly. Their work, along with countless others, helped shift the national conversation, planted those early seeds. And we can't forget about the Great Migration, a massive demographic shift that plays a huge role here.
Okay, so for those who don't know, break down the Great Migration for us. What made it so impactful?
Between 1916 and 1970, that's a long time span, millions of African Americans left the rural South. They migrated to northern cities. And it wasn't just about seeking better opportunities, it was about escaping Jim Crow laws and the brutal realities of segregation.
So this huge influx of people into northern cities, that must really shaken things up.
Oh, absolutely. It changed the social and political landscape.
Yeah.
You had these vibrant Black communities emerging in the North, contributing to the arts, culture, politics, but also facing new forms of discrimination. The point is, this demographic shift made the issue of racial inequality impossible to ignore on a national scale. It was huge.
Okay, so even without Parks's singular act of defiance, things were volatile. It's like that powder keg you mentioned, just waiting for a spark.
Precisely. And Parks' refusal. That was that spark, igniting a movement that was already primed to explode. It resonated so powerfully because it reflected the frustrations and aspirations of millions.
Which brings us to another turning point, one where the stakes were incredibly high. Brown v. Board of Education. The source material really highlighted this 1954 Supreme Court ruling.
Landmark decision, no doubt about it. It declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, right? Effectively dealing a major blow to the legal framework of Jim Crow. But, and this is crucial.
Don't tell me there was backlash.
Oh, absolutely. Major backlash. The Brown v. Board decision was met with fierce resistance, particularly in the South. This wasn't just a court ruling changing hearts and minds overnight. We're talking deeply ingrained prejudice and systemic racism here. You see, the resistance to desegregation, it took many forms. Some groups, like the White Citizens Councils, they used economic and social pressure to try and maintain segregation.
What? Like how?
We're talking boycotts of businesses that supported integration, intimidation tactics, you name it. Anything to hold on to the old ways.
Wow, so it wasn't just about disagreeing with the ruling, it was about actively trying to undermine it, using whatever means necessary.
Exactly. And sadly, tragically really, the resistance often turned violent.
The material mentioned Medgar Evers.
Right, Medgar Evers,
Okay.
a World War II veteran, a civil rights activist, assassinated in Mississippi, 1963.
His murder, and it wasn't the only one, it really underscores the very real dangers faced by those who dared to challenge the status quo. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the violence itself, but the atmosphere of fear it created, trying to silence dissent,
It's a stark reminder that progress doesn't come easy, and it's definitely not a straight line. You mentioned earlier that the civil rights movement was about more than just one event, one person, even one court ruling. It was about a collective fight for justice.
Absolutely.
And when we think about the people involved, we often picture those big names, right? MLK, Rosa Parks, and for good reason. But the material you provided also highlighted a group I'd never really considered in this light: college students.
It's easy to overlook the role of young people in the movement, but honestly, their contributions were absolutely essential. We're talking about groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Wait, SNCC, tell me more about them. Who were they and what made them so impactful?
Imagine this. You're a young person full of idealism, And you're staring down a system that tells you you're less than, that you don't deserve the same rights as others simply because of the color of your skin. What do?
I'd hope I'd have the courage to fight back somehow, but it's hard to say for sure.
Well, for the members of SNCC, fighting back was the only option. They were on the front lines, organizing sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, participating in freedom rides to challenge segregation on interstate buses.
They were putting themselves in incredibly dangerous situations.
They were. These were incredibly brave young people facing arrest, violence, you name it, all to expose the injustices of segregation.
So they weren't just talking about change, they were making change happen, directly challenging those in power.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the freedom rides. What were those exactly?
Picture this. A busload of black and white activists traveling together through the Deep South, deliberately violating Jim Crow laws.
Wow.
The freedom rides, they were meant to test a Supreme Court ruling that outlawed segregation on interstate buses and in terminals. But the reality on the ground, it was far more dangerous than the law suggested it should be.
Because those rulings, they weren't always enforced, especially in the South.
Exactly. And the freedom riders, they faced brutal resistance. Firebombings, beatings, arrests.
It's one thing to hear about segregation in a textbook, but to see those images of young people, just kids really, being attacked for simply trying to sit at a lunch counter or ride a bus, it must have had a huge impact on public opinion.
Absolutely. The actions of SNCC and other youth-led groups, they were instrumental in galvanizing support for the movement. They injected this new energy, a sense of urgency that resonated with people across the country.
Their willingness to put themselves in harm's way, to face down hatred with courage and dignity, it exposed the brutality of segregation for what it truly was.
And they were doing all of this while also facing incredible danger themselves. It's hard to imagine the courage that must have taken. The thing is, nonviolence was a core principle of the movement, right? Inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi.
Right.
Dr. King and other leaders, they recognized that nonviolent resistance, while incredibly difficult to maintain, was a powerful tool for social change.
Because it forced people to see the humanity of those being oppressed.
Exactly. It exposed the violence inherent in the system they were fighting against. When you respond to hatred and brutality with peace and dignity, you shift the moral ground. You awaken the conscience of those watching.
So the impact of groups like SNCC, it went far beyond their numbers. They were at the forefront of a cultural shift, changing hearts and minds one act of defiance at a time.
And they understood that real change, lasting change, it required more than just legislation. It required a fundamental shift in attitudes and beliefs. And sometimes it's those seemingly small acts of courage, those acts of defiance multiplied thousands of times over that can really tip the scales of justice.
It's that ripple effect again, isn't it? One thing leads to another, and suddenly you have this incredible momentum for change. It makes you think about moments like the March on Washington, which the source material mentioned. It's easy to just say the words, but the scale of it.
Over 250,000 people. Imagine that. A sea of humanity, all gathered in the heart of the nation's capital, demanding equal rights, equal opportunity.
And it wasn't just about civil rights, was it?
Right. It was about labor rights, economic justice, voting rights. It shows how interconnected these issues really are.
And this is where we hear Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. Right? I mean, even all these years later, it still gives me chills.
A speech that continues to resonate? Absolutely. A testament to the power of words, to inspire hope, to inspire action. You know, it's interesting to think, if we could rewind the clock, if certain events hadn't unfolded the way they did, would this moment have happened? Would it have had the same impact?
It's almost impossible to imagine, isn't it? Like, what if those in power had listened earlier? Would the March on Washington have had that same urgency, that sense of a movement reaching its peak?
History is full of what-ifs, that's for sure. But one thing's certain. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those were hard-won victories, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. And those victories, they were a direct result of the tireless efforts of so many people, both famous and unknown, who risked everything for a better future.
It's like all those actions, all those acts of courage, the speeches, the marches, the sit-ins, they built up to those legislative victories. But as we know, the fight didn't end there. The source material made that very clear.
Absolutely. The civil rights movement, it wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Dismantling a system built on centuries of oppression. And that kind of change, well, doesn't happen overnight. The fight for equality, it continues today.
Yeah.
In many ways, we're still grappling with these same issues, still striving for that more just and equitable society.
It's a sobering thought, but also empowering in a way, don't you think? We're part of this ongoing story, this fight for a better future. And the choices we make, the actions we take, they matter. They have the potential to create those ripple effects.
Maybe a century from now, someone will look back at our time and point to something that seems small, an act of courage, an act of defiance, that sparked a movement, that changed the course of history. Who knows? We all have that potential within us.
What a powerful thought. This deep dive has been incredible, really. It's given us so much to think about, to learn from, and most importantly, to carry with us as we try to make sense of the world around us. So thank you for taking this journey with us. And remember, the fight for equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable future.